My name is Jack Ellis, and my story begins on New Year's Eve in 2004. I was sitting around the dining room table with my family, enjoying the last few hours of the year. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about that evening, just good food, laughter, and the promise of fresh starts with the coming new year. Everyone was in high spirits, chatting about their resolutions and sharing memories from the past. I was happy, comfortable, surrounded by people I loved, but little did I know, my world was about to be turned upside down. The clock had barely struck 10 when my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound of it pulling me away from the warmth of the family gathering was enough to make me pause. I glanced at the screen. It was my boss. I let out a sigh of frustration and excused myself from the table. "Sorry, folks. Duty calls," I said, giving them an apologetic smile. I stepped outside to the cold, crisp air. The night was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows on the snow-covered ground. I answered the call with a mix of annoyance and professionalism. "Jack, I need you to make an urgent delivery," my boss said, his voice crackling through the phone. "I know it's New Year's Eve, but this can't wait. I need you on the road ASAP." I rubbed my eyes, tired from the evening's festivities. "Come on, it's New Year's. Can't it wait until tomorrow?" I asked, trying to make light of the situation. "No, it can't. I'll make sure you're compensated. Just get the load delivered and we'll call it even." I didn't have much choice. It wasn't often I got an urgent job, and with the promise of a bonus, I begrudgingly agreed. After hanging up, I re-entered the house, grabbed my coat, and told my family I had to head out. They weren't too happy about it, but they understood. "Be safe, Jack. We'll save a plate for you when you get back," my mom said, giving me a tight hug. I climbed into my truck, a rusty but reliable rig I'd been driving for years. The engine rumbled to life with a steady hum, and I pulled away from the house, leaving the warmth of the party behind. The roads were mostly clear, save for a few patches of snow and ice. It was a long drive, and the highway was nearly empty, just me, the endless stretch of road, and the hum of the engine. The further I drove, the quieter the night became. The headlights illuminated the asphalt, the only source of light in the otherwise dark expanse. I had driven this highway countless times, but something felt off tonight. Maybe it was the silence, the eerie emptiness of the road, but it set my nerves on edge. It wasn't long before I started to feel the weight of the hours ahead of me. I was a long-haul trucker, and the night shift was nothing new, but tonight was different. A few hours into the drive, as I passed the outskirts of town, my truck gave a sudden lurch. The engine sputtered, and the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. The check engine light flashed, and the temperature gauge spiked into the red zone. My stomach sank. I cursed under my breath, easing the truck onto the side of the highway. It came to a slow, jerking stop. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring at the dashboard in disbelief. It was late, and I was miles away from the nearest mechanic. The cold air outside the truck seemed to seep into the cab, adding to the unease I already felt. I tried restarting the truck, but it wasn't having any of it. With a resigned sigh, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out, walking around the truck to see if I could spot anything obvious. There was nothing I could do. The engine was shot for now, and I was stuck. There wasn't a lot of traffic on this stretch of highway, and it was starting to look like I was going to be here for a while. That's when I saw it, another car on the side of the road, about half a mile ahead. The hazard lights were flashing intermittently, casting a dim glow in the distance. "Great," I muttered to myself. "Another person stranded. Maybe they can help me." I grabbed my jacket and started walking towards the car, not sure what to expect. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The car appeared to be abandoned. The driver's side door was wide open, and there was no one in sight. The headlights were off, but the interior light was on, casting an eerie glow inside the vehicle. I hesitated, my boots crunching in the snow as I walked up to the car. The inside looked as if someone had left in a hurry. A cup of coffee sat in the cup holder, steam still rising from it, despite the freezing temperature. A snakeskin coat was draped across the passenger seat, and a pair of shoes lay discarded on the floor. A handbag was half open on the passenger seat, and the contents spilled slightly onto the leather interior. It was like someone had been there moments ago, but had vanished without a trace. I took a step closer, my curiosity getting the best of me. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten, a love letter, crumpled in the center of the seat. The handwriting was sloppy, as if written in haste, and the words were desperate. I carefully unfolded it and read aloud under my breath. "I never leave without you. I love you. If you don't come back to me, I will never live without you." A sense of unease washed over me. Something about the words seemed wrong. They felt like a warning. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise behind me. I turned around, my heart racing. There was nothing. Just the dark, empty highway stretching endlessly in both directions. I stepped back, my mind racing. Maybe it was just the wind or my imagination running wild in the quiet of the night. But then it happened. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure moving in the distance. Fast, too fast to be human. I turned, trying to catch a glimpse, but it was already too late. I never saw what came next, just a sudden, blinding flash of light. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, hard floor of a dimly lit cabin. My head throbbed, and my hands were tied behind my back. Panic set in as I tried to move, but the ropes were tight, cutting into my skin. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The cabin was old, run down, and smelled of mildew. The only light came from a small lantern hanging in the corner. Two figures stood in front of me, their faces obscured by shadows. One of them stepped forward and spoke, his voice cold and emotionless. "Where is the bag you were supposed to deliver?" I blinked, confused. "What bag?" I managed to croak. The figure repeated the question, this time with more force. "Where is the bag?" I shook my head. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just stranded on the highway." Without warning, the figures started to beat me. The blows came fast and hard, and I struggled against my restraints, but it was no use. My vision blurred, and I couldn't tell how long it went on. Eventually, they stopped, leaving me bruised and bloodied. They left the cabin, but I knew they wouldn't be gone for long. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes, I couldn't tell. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. When they returned the next day, they asked again, more forcefully, "Where's the bag?" This time, I refused to answer. "I don't know anything about any bag," my voice cracked with desperation. That's when another figure appeared in the doorway. This one was different. Their face was covered, and they exuded an aura of authority. They spoke calmly, but with an edge of finality. "This is not over. Release him." The two figures glanced at each other, then nodded. They untied my hands and pushed me to my feet. I stumbled, but managed to stay upright. The masked figure turned to the two men. "Let him go. He doesn't know anything." I was released, but the horror wasn't over. The masked figure led me out of the cabin and back to the road. As I approached my truck, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They arrived soon after, and I was questioned, though I had nothing to offer. I explained everything I had seen and heard, but no one seemed to believe me. The police arrested one of the figures, the one who had been asking about the bag. The man was charged with kidnapping, and after a long struggle, he was eventually convicted. The love letter, the car, the mysterious bag, everything tied back to him. The story made the local news, but it didn't stop the nightmares that followed. The masked figure, the dark cabin, the sound of those footsteps in the snow, they haunt me to this day. My name is Charlie Grant. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 2 decades, a job that's as much a part of me as my love for my family. I've got 2 kids, Tokyo and Ethan, and a wife, Susan, who always makes sure there's a warm meal waiting whenever I return from a haul. Life on the road can be lonely, but having Pete, my lifelong friend, as a co-driver made it bearable. Together, we shared stories, laughter, and the long miles stretching across countless highways. It was a bond that turned work into something meaningful. And it was the summer of Pete and I were hauling supplies from Salt Lake City to Denver, our rig packed with crates of electronics. The sun had just set, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple as we cruised along a quiet highway. The cab was filled with the comforting hum of the engine, the occasional crackle of the CB radio, and Pete's off-key singing. "Charlie," Pete said, grinning as he leaned back in the passenger seat, "you ever think about retiring to some beach? Trucking's good and all, but one day, I just want to sit in the sun and drink cold beer all day." I laughed, shaking my head. "Pete, you wouldn't last a week without the road. You'd miss the miles, the diners, and probably me too much." He chuckled, tipping his worn-out cap. "Maybe you're right, but a guy can dream, can't he?" The highway stretched on, the traffic thinning as we neared a more remote section. Dense trees lined either side, their dark silhouettes looming like silent sentinels under the rising moon. We both loved the peace of these stretches where the world felt far away and it was just us in the open road. About an hour into this calm, Pete shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Hey, Charlie, pull over. I gotta use the bathroom." I glanced around. "There's no rest stop here. You'll have to hold it until we hit the next one." He shook his head, already unbuckling his seatbelt. "Nah, just stop here. I'll head into the trees. Don't worry, it's not my first time roughing it." I sighed but obliged, pulling the rig onto the shoulder. Pete grabbed a flashlight and a water bottle, grinning as he hopped down. "Don't fall asleep on me, Charlie. I'll be right back." I leaned back, watching as his figure disappeared into the tree line, the faint glow of his flashlight bobbing through the shadows. The cab fell silent except for the ticking of the cooling engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I didn't think much of it at first. Pete wasn't the type to dawdle, but he also wasn't the type to rush if he didn't need to. 15 minutes passed, then 20. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 30 minutes. What the hell is taking him so long? I muttered, more annoyed than concerned. Still, a gnawing unease began to creep in. I rolled down the window and called out into the darkness. "Pete, you good out there?" No answer. I waited another few minutes, then grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the truck. The night air was cool and still, the forest eerily quiet. As I stepped toward the trees, I heard a distant dog bark, a sharp, aggressive sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Then came a scream. It was unmistakable, raw, and terrified, cutting through the night like a knife. "Pete?" I shouted, breaking into a jog toward the forest. My flashlight beam danced over the uneven ground as I plunged into the woods. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at the sky. The air felt heavier here, the silence oppressive. As I moved deeper into the forest, the barking grew louder, joined by the rustling of leaves and low murmurs. I slowed, my heart pounding as I approached a small clearing. That's when I saw them. 5 men stood in a loose circle, each wearing a dark hooded jacket. Beside each of them was a large snarling dog, their eyes gleaming in the flashlight's beam. My breath caught as I spotted Pete. He was slumped over, unconscious, being dragged by one of the men. His flashlight lay abandoned on the ground, its beam pointing uselessly at the trees. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, my voice trembling but loud enough to echo through the clearing. The men froze, their heads snapping toward me. For a moment we stood there, locked in a tense standoff. Then, without a word, one of them pointed, and the others began to move. 2 of the dogs lunged forward, their handlers releasing the leashes. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush as the dogs barked and growled behind me. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, its beam flickering as if it might give out at any moment. I didn't stop until I burst out of the forest and back onto the highway. When I reached the truck, I found the door hanging open. Inside, the cab was a mess. Several crates from the haul were missing, and the dashboard was covered in scratches as if someone had rummaged through it in a hurry. My chest tightened with panic, but there was no time to dwell on the theft. I grabbed the CB radio and called for help, my voice shaking as I relayed my location and what had happened. "This is Charlie Grant, trucker on Highway 76 near the Forest Road. My friend's been taken and there are men with dogs. Please, send help." The dispatcher's calm voice crackled through the speaker. "Stay where you are, Charlie. Officers are on their way." It felt like an eternity before the flashing lights of police cars appeared in the distance. The officers arrived quickly, their presence a small comfort in the chaos. I explained everything as best as I could, leading them to the clearing where I had last seen Pete. The forest was eerily quiet as we searched, the officers' flashlights cutting through the darkness. Then, one of them shouted, "Over here!" We rushed to the spot and found Pete lying on the ground, unconscious but alive. His face was pale and there were bruises on his arms, but he was breathing. An officer radioed for medical assistance while the rest of us continued to search for the hooded men. But they were gone, leaving no trace behind except for the faint impressions of footprints and paw prints in the dirt. Pete was taken to the hospital, and I stayed behind to answer more questions. The stolen goods were a significant loss, but all I cared about was Pete's safety. The officers assured me they would investigate, but deep down, I had my doubts. The men and their dogs had vanished into the night, like ghosts. Later, when Pete woke up, he couldn't remember much. He said he'd seen the men in the forest and tried to run, but the dogs had cornered him. After that, everything went black. He never spoke about it again, and I didn't press him. Some things are better left buried. To this day, I avoid that stretch of highway. My name is James, and I've been driving rigs long enough to know that the road. It was a quiet, moonlit night in the middle of the Arizona desert. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by nothing but sand and scattered shrubs. My rig, loaded with spare car parts bound for a warehouse in Phoenix, rumbled steadily along the asphalt. The radio crackled with static. I had lost the signal hours ago. Just the hum of the engine and the faint whistle of the wind for company. As I crested a small rise, I noticed a pair of headlights in the distance. 2 cars were parked side by side on the shoulder of the road, their engines off but hazard lights blinking in the darkness. At first I thought they had broken down, and I slowed, intending to offer help. But as I got closer, something about the scene made me uneasy. 7 figures were huddled between the vehicles, moving in tense, deliberate motions. In the dim light I could make out the glint of metal pistols. My stomach twisted. One man was holding a duffel bag, while another handed over a similar bag in exchange. They were speaking, but I couldn't hear them over the sound of my truck. Then I saw her, a girl slumped in the back seat of one of the cars. She wasn't moving. I couldn't tell if she was unconscious or worse. Whatever was going on, it was nothing good. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as I rolled past, trying not to draw attention. But it was too late. One of the men turned sharply, his eyes locking onto my truck. He shouted something, and the others followed his gaze. I didn't wait to find out what they were planning. My foot hit the accelerator, and the rig roared to life, its tires kicking up dust as I sped down the highway. In my rearview mirror, I saw the car's headlights snap on. They peeled out onto the road, their engines screaming as they began to chase me. "Damn it," I muttered, my pulse pounding. I grabbed the CB radio. "This is James, trucker on Highway 67. I'm being followed by 2 cars, 7 armed men. They're shooting, need immediate assistance." Static crackled in response. No reply. My heart sank as I realized I was too far out for anyone to hear me. I cursed under my breath and focused on the road, praying for a miracle. A sharp pop jolted me from my thoughts. A bullet shattered the passenger side mirror, sending shards of glass into the cab. I swerved instinctively, the truck lurching as the tires skidded on the asphalt. Another shot rang out, this one hitting the trailer with a metallic clang. The cars were gaining on me, their headlights glaring like twin predators' eyes. One pulled alongside the rig, and I saw a man leaning out of the passenger window, his pistol aimed at me. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, forcing the car onto the shoulder. It swerved wildly, kicking up a plume of dust before falling back. Come on, I muttered, scanning the horizon for any sign of help. The highway seemed endless, the desert stretching out in all directions like an ocean of sand. Another shot whizzed past, this one grazing the metal frame of the cab. My hands were slick with sweat, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. The headlights behind me bobbed and swerved, relentless in their pursuit. I spotted something in the distance, a faint glow on the horizon. Hope surged in my chest. It had to be a town, or at least a gas station. Somewhere with people, somewhere safe. "Almost there," I whispered, urging the truck forward. The engine roared in protest as I pushed it to its limit, the speedometer needle climbing higher than I'd ever dared to take it before. The glow grew brighter, resolving into the neon lights of a diner, a lone beacon in the desert night. As I approached, I saw cars parked outside, their silhouettes illuminated by strings of colorful lights hanging from the roof. A seasonal party was in full swing, laughter and music drifting faintly through the air. The sight was both a relief and a terror. Relief because I wasn't alone anymore. Terror because I was about to lead a group of armed men straight into a crowd of unsuspecting people. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just short of the diner's parking lot. The pursuing cars slowed, their headlights cutting through the dust cloud I'd left behind. For a moment, they hesitated, their engines idling as if deciding whether to continue. Then, as if on some unspoken command, they turned around and sped back the way they had come. I watched in stunned silence as their taillights disappeared into the darkness. It didn't make sense. Why would they give up now? Shaking, I climbed out of the cab and approached the diner. The music and laughter grew louder as I neared, the festive atmosphere a stark contrast to the terror I'd just escaped. But something about the scene felt off. The air was heavy, the shadows deeper than they should have been under the bright lights. I stepped inside, and the chatter stopped instantly. Every face turned toward me, their expressions unnervingly blank. The music cut out with a distorted screech, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Sorry to barge in," I said, my voice sounding small and uncertain. "Just had some trouble on the road. Thought I'd stop here for a bit." No one responded. They just stared, their eyes unblinking. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something strange about them. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their movements were unnaturally stiff. It was as if they weren't quite human. I backed toward the door, my instinct screaming at me to leave, but before I could reach it, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the diner into darkness. The air grew colder, and a low guttural growl echoed from somewhere deep within the building. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the growling grew louder, joined by the sound of shuffling footsteps. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The figures were no longer seated. They stood in a loose circle around me, their faces contorted into grotesque masks of rage. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I didn't wait to see what they would do. With a desperate burst of strength, I threw myself against the door. It gave way, and I stumbled outside, gasping for air. The party lights were still on, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot, but the cars were gone and the desert was silent. Too silent. Even the wind had stopped. I ran back to the truck, my mind racing. As I climbed into the cab, I noticed something on the windshield, a handprint, smeared in blood. The engine roared to life, and I sped away from the diner, not daring to look back. The glow of its lights faded into the distance, leaving me alone once more on the dark highway. When I finally reached a town, I reported everything to the local police. They listened, their faces grim but skeptical. A patrol was sent to the diner, but they found nothing. No cars, no people, just an empty building with shattered windows and strange symbols etched into the walls. My name is Edward Johnson, and I've been driving trucks for nearly 15 years. I didn't always think I'd end up in this line of work. Before I became a trucker, I was a mechanic, working long hours at a small auto shop in the middle of nowhere. But life has a way of nudging you in a direction you didn't expect. One day, my friend Carl, who had been a trucker for years, came to me and told me about the open road. He made it sound so freeing, the vast expanse of highways stretching out before you, the endless adventure, and the solitude. At first, I wasn't sure. A mechanic's life was simple. You worked on cars, got dirty, and went home. But there was something about the open road, the idea of hauling freight and seeing new places that intrigued me. The idea of driving a truck became more tempting with each passing day. One day, I decided to take the leap. I enrolled in truck driving school, got my CDL, and found myself behind the wheel of a massive semi-truck. It wasn't easy at first. The road was nothing like the quiet, predictable work I was used to, but slowly, I became more comfortable with it. The hum of the engine, the shifting of gears, and the long stretches of highway became my new normal. Night driving, in particular, was something I grew to love. It was quiet, the world seemed still, and the only noise was the soft roar of my truck's engine. On that particular night, I was on a lonely stretch of highway, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The roads were clear, the stars above were brilliant, and the only thing that kept me company was the hum of my truck as it sped along the road. It was one of those nights where everything felt calm, like the world was at peace. As I drove, I thought back on how I had come to this point, how being a trucker had allowed me to see parts of the country I never would have otherwise. Sure, it had its downsides, like the isolation and the long hours, but there was something beautiful about the quiet of the road. It was the kind of peace you could only find on a lonely stretch of highway. Just as I was getting comfortable, I saw headlights ahead. A truck, a big rig, was parked on the side of the road. As I got closer, I saw the figure of a man standing beside the truck, waving me down. I slowed my truck down and pulled to the side, wondering what was going on. The other truck had its hazard lights flashing, and the man was pacing back and forth in the dark, his figure illuminated by the truck's lights. I rolled down my window and stuck my head out. "Hey there," he called, his voice deep but friendly. "Mind stopping for a second?" I slowed to a stop, the engine rumbling as I put it in park. "What's going on?" I asked, still a little cautious about this stranger on the side of the road. The man, who looked to be in his mid-40s, approached my truck. He was tall, wearing a worn-out trucker cap and a thick jacket. His face was rough, like a man who had spent too many years on the road. "I'm having some trouble with my radio," he said, walking up to my window. "I need to make a call. Can you spare a phone?" I didn't hesitate. I was always a believer in helping out fellow truckers, so I reached into my pocket and handed him my phone. "Thanks," he said, taking it. "I won't be long." He dialed a number, and I waited, the quiet of the night pressing in on me. The road was empty, not a single car in sight. I watched him as he spoke into the phone, his words low and hurried. After a minute, he handed me my phone back. "Here you go," he said with a small smile. "Appreciate it." "No problem," I replied, feeling a little awkward now that he was standing there silent, just staring off into the distance. There was a moment of silence, the night air cold around us. Then the man broke it. "You got a light?" he asked, his voice a little hoarse. I nodded and pulled out my lighter, handing it to him. He took it, lighting his cigarette with a sigh of relief. For a while we stood there in the quiet, just smoking and watching the empty highway. The occasional truck or car would pass by, but otherwise it was just us and the dark road. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He looked at me for a moment, taking another drag of his cigarette. "Nowhere special," he said. "Just hauling some goods, nothing too important." There was something strange about the way he said it. I felt like he was holding something back, but I didn't press. Truckers had their secrets, and it wasn't my place to pry. I shifted on my feet, trying to think of something else to say. But before I could speak, I heard something, a faint noise in the distance. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but then it became clearer. children's laughter. I froze for a second, straining to hear. The sound was unmistakable, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It didn't make sense. We were out here in the middle of nowhere, and the last thing I expected to hear was the sound of kids playing. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking over at the trucker. He seemed to stiffen. His eyes darted to the distance, and then he shook his head. "No," he said quickly, his voice tight. "Probably just the wind." But I wasn't so sure. The laughter, the sound of children, was too real. It had come from somewhere nearby. I glanced around again, trying to locate where it was coming from, but the road was empty. The sound just hung in the air. The trucker lit another cigarette, the red glow casting an eerie light on his face. "Maybe it's nothing," he said, his voice strangely calm. "Anyway, you delivering anything interesting tonight?" I raised an eyebrow, sensing that he didn't want to talk about what we'd just heard. "Just the usual stuff," I said. "Some auto parts. Nothing too exciting." He nodded, but his gaze was distant, like he wasn't really paying attention. As we stood there in silence, another car sped past us, its headlights blinding in the dark. "Look at that maniac," the trucker muttered under his breath. "Going way too fast. If they keep that up, they'll be in a ditch in no time." I nodded in agreement, but the strange feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach wasn't going away. Something about this whole encounter felt off. It was like I was in the middle of a dream, unreal and unsettling. "Well, I've got to keep moving," the trucker said abruptly, flicking his cigarette onto the road. "Take care, buddy." He climbed into his truck and started the engine. I watched as his rig slowly pulled back onto the highway, his lights fading into the distance. The silence seemed to swallow up everything around me. I climbed back into my truck and started the engine. A few miles ahead, I saw a diner with its lights on, so I decided to stop and get some food. My stomach had been growling for hours, and a warm meal sounded too good to pass up. I pulled into the diner's parking lot, the fluorescent lights of the sign flickering as I walked inside. The warm air inside was a relief after the cold night outside. I ordered a quick meal and ate in silence, still thinking about the strange encounter with the other trucker. But as the night went on, I pushed it to the back of my mind. After finishing my meal, I headed back to my truck, but when I was back on the road, something was different. I saw flashing police lights up ahead. Curious, I slowed down and pulled over. An officer approached my truck, his face serious. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," the officer said. "What's going on?" I asked, my heart starting to race. The officer pointed to the truck I had seen earlier. "That truck," he said. "We found 12 children locked in the back." My blood ran cold. The laughter, the strange behavior of the trucker, it all clicked into place now. "Where are the kids now?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They're safe," the officer replied. "But this isn't over. We've got a lot to investigate." I watched as the police began to arrest the other trucker. He didn't put up a fight. It was like he knew what was coming. My mind raced, the pieces falling into place. The whole situation was more than just a simple truck stop. As the officer walked away, I sat there in my truck, still trying to make sense of it all. It felt like something straight out of a nightmare. The laughter, the secrecy, and the children locked away in the back of a truck. I had been lucky, too lucky maybe. My name's Dale Garner, and I've been hauling freight across the country for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road, ghost towns, freak weather, you name it. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered that night. It was just past midnight, and I was running a route through rural Montana. The highway stretched out in front of me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through endless darkness. My CB radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other truckers, but the road was otherwise dead. The weather was perfect for driving, crisp and cool with a clear sky, and I was making good time. Then, about halfway through my run, I saw the flashing hazard lights up ahead. At first, I thought it was a stalled vehicle or maybe someone changing a tire. As I got closer, I realized it was a jackknife semi blocking part of the road. "Damn," I muttered, slowing my rig. The trailer was at an odd angle, its front smashed into the guardrail. Broken glass glittered under my headlights and steam rose from the hood. But what struck me was the eerie stillness, no sign of the driver or any other vehicles. I pulled over onto the shoulder, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed out. The night air was silent except for the faint hiss of the damaged truck's engine. Walking closer, I scanned the area. "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. The cab door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside, it was empty. No driver, no personal belongings, just a faint smell of burnt rubber and diesel. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Where the hell was the driver? I stepped back, shining my flashlight toward the surrounding area. The highway was bordered by dense pine forest on either side, the kind of woods that swallowed sound and light. Maybe the driver had wandered off for help, but why leave the cab door open and the hazards on? I grabbed my CB mic and called out, "This is Roadrunner. Got an abandoned rig at mile marker 243 on Route 87. Anyone got eyes on this?" Static crackled, then a voice replied, "Negative, Roadrunner. That stretch has been quiet all night. You sure it's abandoned?" "Yeah," I said, glancing at the empty cab. "No sign of the driver. Copy that." "You staying put?" "Figured I'd take a look around," I said, though my gut was telling me to get back in my truck and keep driving. "Be careful," the voice warned. A lot of weird stories about that area. I walked around the truck, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The trailer's side was gouged with deep scratches like something had clawed it. I frowned. Maybe it had been an animal, but what kind of animal could do that to reinforced metal? Behind the truck, skid marks stretched down the highway, ending in a patch of disturbed gravel. It looked like the driver had tried to avoid something, or someone. My flashlight caught something glinting in the gravel. Bending down, I picked up a mangled pair of glasses. The lenses were cracked, the frames twisted. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed off the trees, but there was no response. Then I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the woods. I turned, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hey, if you're out there, say something." The rustling stopped. I stared into the darkness, my heart pounding. Slowly, I backed away, returning to the truck's cab. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Bloody handprints on the inside of the driver's door. My stomach churned. The prints were smudged, as if the driver had been dragged out. I hurried back to my rig and grabbed my cell phone, but there was no signal. Typical for this part of the country. I decided to take another look, this time focusing on the woods where I'd heard the rustling. The flashlight beam danced over the underbrush, illuminating twisted tree roots and thick ferns. About 20 yards in, I found more disturbed ground, as if someone or something had been dragged through. Following the trail, I noticed odd markings on the trees. Long parallel grooves like claw marks scarred the bark. A low guttural growl sounded behind me, and I froze. Turning slowly, I saw nothing but darkness. My flashlight flickered, then went out. "Come on, not now," I muttered, smacking it against my palm. When it came back on, I caught a glimpse of movement, something large slipping between the trees. I sprinted back to the highway, my boots crunching on the gravel. As I neared the abandoned truck, I saw a figure standing by my rig. Relief flooded me. Maybe it was the driver. "Hey!" I called out. The figure turned, and my relief turned to dread. It wasn't the driver. It was a man, tall and gaunt, wearing tattered clothes. His eyes gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice raspy and hollow. "I'm just trying to help," I replied, keeping my distance. "Are you the driver?" He shook his head. "The driver's gone. Took the wrong road." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He pointed toward the woods. "It doesn't like intruders. If you stay, it'll take you too." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness as if he'd never been there. I climbed back into my truck, locking the doors and starting the engine. My headlights illuminated the abandoned rig, the empty cab looking even more sinister. As I reached for the gear shift, a loud thud reverberated from the trailer behind me. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. Something was on the trailer, or in it. My first instinct was to drive, but curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my flashlight and a tire iron, I stepped out, circling around to the back of my truck. The trailer door was slightly ajar, the padlock broken. I hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside, the cargo, pallets of canned goods, was intact, but something moved in the shadows. "Who's in there?" I demanded, raising the tire iron. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at me, and a low growl echoed from the depths of the trailer. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my hands shaking. Whatever was inside wasn't human. I jumped back into the cab and floored it, the tires screeching as I pulled back onto the highway. The abandoned rig disappeared in my rearview mirror, but my sense of unease didn't fade. The CB crackled again, this time with static that sounded almost like breathing. "You can't escape," a distorted voice whispered. My grip tightened on the wheel. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in like a tunnel. I pushed the rig harder, the engine roaring in protest. Then the headlights flickered, and I felt a heavy impact on the trailer. Whatever had been in the abandoned truck, or my own, was now on me. The rig swerved as I tried to keep control, the rear tires skidding on the asphalt. I spotted a clearing up ahead and veered off the road, the truck jolting as it came to a stop. Grabbing my tire iron, I climbed out, my heart pounding. The back of the trailer was dented, deep gouges marring the metal. A low growl came from the woods, and I turned, raising the tire iron. The creature stepped into the clearing, a hulking wolf-like thing with matted fur and glowing eyes. Its jaws dripped with saliva, and its claws glinted in the moonlight. It lunged, and I swung the tire iron with all my strength. The metal connected with a sickening crack, but the creature barely flinched. I stumbled back, tripping over a rock and falling to the ground. As it loomed over me, ready to strike, the sound of an air horn shattered the silence. Another truck barreled into the clearing, its headlights blinding the creature. It snarled and retreated into the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The driver of the other truck helped me to my feet, his face pale. "You're lucky I came through here," he said. "That thing's been hunting this stretch of road for years." "What was it?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Something you don't want to meet again," he replied. I didn't argue. After thanking him, I climbed back into my truck and followed him to the nearest town. I never drove that road again, and I've never been able to explain what happened. My name is Jack Harrison, and I've been a trucker for the past 15 years. There's a unique solitude to the open road, especially when the rest of the world is asleep or celebrating. It's a life of silence, with only the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of a late-night radio show for company. But one New Year's Eve, I learned that solitude could quickly turn into something far darker and far more terrifying. I was on an overnight haul, a run that would take me through the remote stretches of Montana. The route wasn't unfamiliar to me, and I'd always found comfort in the stillness of those long, lonely highways. That night, snow was coming down in thick, heavy flakes, and the roads were nearly deserted. The headlights of my rig cut through the swirling white, and the only sound was the steady thrum of the tires against the asphalt. The clock on my dashboard read 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes to midnight. Normally, I'd have found a truck stop by now, maybe grabbed a coffee and waited for the New Year countdown. But the weather had delayed my schedule, and I still had miles to cover before my next stop. My radio was tuned to a local station, where a cheerful host was rattling off New Year's trivia and taking calls from listeners eager to share their resolutions. It was a reminder of the world outside my cab, a world that felt impossibly far away. As the final minutes of the year ticked by, the road ahead became even more isolated. The gas gauge was hovering precariously close to empty, and I knew I needed to refuel soon. The next gas station was supposed to be about 20 miles up the road. I kept my eyes peeled for the glow of neon through the snow, feeling a growing unease creep into the back of my mind. At exactly midnight, the radio host shouted a jubilant "Happy New Year!" A chorus of noisemakers and cheers followed, but the sound was abruptly cut off. Static hissed through the speakers, loud and sharp, making me wince. I fiddled with the dial, trying to find a clear signal, but the static persisted. Giving up, I switched the radio off and drove on in silence. The gas station came into view about 10 minutes later. It was an old, worn-down place, the kind you'd expect to see in a horror movie. A single flickering neon sign spelled out "gas" in ghostly green letters, and one of the two pumps was wrapped in yellow caution tape. There were no other vehicles in sight, and the windows of the small convenience store were dark. I considered driving on, but the gas gauge was dangerously low. I didn't have a choice. Pulling up to the functional pump, I stepped out of the cab and into the biting cold. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind howled through the empty lot. The pump's screen was scratched and barely legible, but it still worked. As I filled the tank, I glanced around uneasily. Something about the place felt off, like it was suspended in time, forgotten by the rest of the world. The sound of the pump clicking off startled me, and I replaced the nozzle quickly. I was just about to climb back into the cab when I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the lot, barely visible through the snow. It was a man, dressed in an old tattered coat, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't move, didn't wave or call out. He just stood there, watching. "Hey, you need something?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. The man didn't respond. Unease prickled along my spine, and I hurried back into the truck, locking the doors behind me. As I pulled out of the station, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was still there, standing in the exact same spot. The next stretch of desolate. The snow had turned into a full-blown storm, and visibility was almost non-existent. I had to slow to a crawl, squinting to see the faint outlines of the road markers. The tension in my chest grew with every mile, and I couldn't shake the image of the man at the gas station. There had been something deeply unsettling about the way he'd stood there so still, as if he were waiting for something. About 20 minutes later, I saw lights ahead. At first, I thought it was another vehicle, but as I got closer, I realized it was a pair of headlights parked on the shoulder of the road. It was a pickup truck, its engine idling and its hazards flashing. As I approached, I saw a figure standing next to it, waving frantically. Against my better judgment, I slowed to a stop and rolled down the passenger window slightly. "Hey, you all right?" The man, a different one this time, younger and dressed more appropriately for the weather, ran up to the truck, his face pale and panicked. "My truck's dead," his breath visible in the freezing air. "Can you give me a lift, just to the next town?" I hesitated. Picking up a hitchhiker in the middle of nowhere during a snowstorm wasn't exactly high on my list of smart decisions, but the guy looked genuinely distressed, and I couldn't just leave him there to freeze. "All right, get in," I said, unlocking the door. He climbed in quickly, shivering as he settled into the passenger. "Thanks, man. I really appreciate it," he said, his voice shaky. "Name's Kyle." "Jack," I replied, keeping my eyes on the road as I started driving again. "Where are you headed?" "Just anywhere there's people," he said vaguely. This storm came out of nowhere. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the soft hiss of snow against the windshield. Kyle fidgeted nervously, glancing out the window and then back at me. "You see anyone else out here?" he asked suddenly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Before you picked me up," he said, "did you see anyone else? Maybe standing by the road or at a gas station?" A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. "Yeah," I said slowly. "There was a guy back at a station a few miles back." "Why?" Kyle's face went pale. "You need to keep driving," he said urgently. "Don't stop. Not for anything." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my grip tightening on the wheel. "Just trust me," he said, his voice rising. "If you see anyone else out here, don't stop. Don't even slow down. They're not." Before he could finish, the truck's headlights illuminated another figure in the middle of the road. It was the man from the gas station. He was standing perfectly still, directly in our path. "What the hell?" I muttered, slamming on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt, and Kyle grabbed my arm. "Don't stop," he shouted. "Go around him." But it was too late. The man was already moving toward us, his footsteps slow and deliberate. His face was still obscured, but there was something wrong about the way he moved, like his limbs didn't quite work the way they should. My instincts screamed at me to hit the gas, but I was frozen, staring as the figure got closer and closer. Kyle was practically shaking. "Jack, go," he pleaded. "Now." Snapping out of my trance, I floored the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, veering around the man in the road. As we passed him, I risked a glance in the side mirror. He was standing there, watching us, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. For the next several miles, neither of us spoke. The tension in the cab was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Kyle kept looking over his shoulder, his expression grim. Finally, the outline of a small diner appeared through the snow, its windows glowing warmly. I pulled into the parking lot, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. The place was empty, but the lights were on and the door was unlocked. Kyle and I hurried inside, grateful to be out of the storm. The diner was eerily quiet. There was no staff, no other customers. Just a pot of coffee sitting on the counter, still steaming. Kyle and I exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't speak. We each poured ourselves a cup and sat down at a booth near the back. "What's going on?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Kyle stared into his coffee. "I don't know," he said, "but whatever it is, it's not human." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was crazy, but deep down, I knew he was right. There was something out there, something that didn't belong. Suddenly, the lights in the diner flickered. The faint sound of static crackled through the air, followed by a low, guttural growl. Kyle and I froze, our eyes locked on the front door. The snow outside had stopped, but the windows were completely fogged over, obscuring our view. Then we heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the diner's roof. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, a desolate ribbon of asphalt cutting through a sea of blackness. My only company was the occasional road sign, the rhythmic hum of my 18-wheeler's engine, and the haunting glow of the moon hanging low in the sky. I was hauling a load of timber across the Midwest, a route I knew like the back of my hand. It was the kind of job that could wear on a person lonely nights, cheap coffee, and countless hours of introspection. But this night felt different. There was something oppressive about the air, a heaviness that settled into my chest and wouldn't let go. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 2:17 a.m. Still hours to go, I muttered to myself. The CB radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Rig Bob. Anyone else on this lonely stretch?" I reached for the mic, grateful for the distraction. "This is Roadrunner." "What's up, Bob?" "Nothing much, Bob's voice replied, tinged with weariness. "Just making sure I'm not the only one out here. You notice anything?" "Strange tonight?" "Strange how?" I asked, sitting up straighter in my seat. "I don't know. Can't shake the feeling I'm being watched." I chuckled, trying to dismiss the unease creeping into my own mind. "Probably just too much coffee, Bob. Paranoia kicks in after a while." "Maybe," he replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "You be safe out there, Roadrunner." The radio went silent, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. I rolled down the window, letting the cold night air slap me awake. The sound of the wind filled the cab, and for a moment, it drowned out the eerie quiet. Then I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. They were draped in a tattered coat, their face obscured by shadows. My foot instinctively moved to the brake, but something stopped me. A gut feeling, a primal instinct, screamed at me to keep driving. As I sped past, I caught a glimpse of their face in the rearview mirror. Hollow eyes stared back at me, and a crooked smile spread across their pale, gaunt features. My heart skipped a beat. Just some drifter, I told myself, though the words felt hollow. I checked the mirrors again. The figure was gone. I tried to shake off the unease as the miles rolled by, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The dashboard clock now read 3:02 a.m., and fatigue was setting in. I considered pulling over at the next rest stop, but a glance at the map told me it was still another 40 miles away. The CB radio crackled again. This time, it was a different voice. "Help me," it whispered, barely audible. "Who's out there?" I asked, gripping the mic tightly. The line went dead. I scanned the road ahead, my eyes darting to every shadow. The highway seemed darker now, as if the night itself was closing in. And then I saw the truck. It was parked on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking, a tanker, its silver surface reflecting the faint moonlight. I slowed down as I approached, my headlights revealing a figure slumped against the front tire. They looked injured. I pulled over, grabbing my flashlight before stepping out of the cab. The cold air bit at my skin as I approached the figure. "Hey, you okay?" I called out. No response. I moved closer, my flashlight illuminating their face. It was a man, his eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. His throat was slit, a dark crimson stain spreading across his shirt. I stumbled back, my stomach churning. The sound of a truck engine roared to life behind me. Spinning around, I saw my rig rolling forward, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. "No!" I shouted, sprinting after it, but it was too late. My truck vanished into the night, leaving me stranded. Panic set in as I stood there. The dead man's lifeless eyes burned into my mind. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. "Get it together," I muttered, forcing myself to think rationally. The rest stop wasn't too far. If I walked, I could make it before dawn. I started down the highway, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my boots. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. After what felt like hours, I saw the glow of the rest stop lights in the distance. Relief washed over me as I quickened my pace. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The parking lot was empty, save for one vehicle, my truck. It sat there, engine idling, as if waiting for me. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The cab door was open, the interior bathed in the green glow of the dashboard lights. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I climbed into the cab, my heart pounding. Everything looked normal, but a chill ran down my spine. I reached for the CB mic, intending to call for help, but stopped when I saw the message scrawled across the windshield in what looked like blood. "Keep driving." Against my better judgment, I started the journey again, the rest stop fading into the rearview mirror. The night seemed darker than ever, the road stretching endlessly before me. The CB radio crackled once more. "Roadrunner, you there?" It was Bob. "Yeah, I'm here," I replied, my voice hoarse. "Something's not right, Bob. I think someone's following me." "You're not alone," he said cryptically. "What do you mean?" I demanded. Static filled the line, followed by a low, guttural laugh. I slammed the radio down, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The road ahead seemed to twist and turn unnaturally, the lines blurring together. My headlights flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw the figure from earlier standing in the middle of the road. Then, the truck jerked violently to the side. I fought to keep control, the tires screeching as I veered onto the shoulder. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. I sat there, breathing heavily, the silence pressing in on me. My flashlight flickered to life as I stepped out of the cab, scanning the area. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the void. A faint whisper reached my ears, coming from the nearby woods. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dense trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until they formed words. "You shouldn't have stopped." I turned around, but the path back to the truck was gone. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees looming like silent sentinels. My flashlight flickered again, and in its dying light, I saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes and crooked smiles identical to the one I'd seen earlier. They moved closer, their whispers filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. I ran, stumbling through the underbrush, branches clawing at my skin. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. Finally, I broke through the trees, collapsing onto the asphalt. My truck sat a few feet away, engine idling, the cab door open. Without thinking, I climbed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The windshield was clean, the bloodied message gone. The CB radio crackled to life one last time. "Keep driving," the voice whispered. I obeyed. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I never saw Bob again, and the dispatcher claimed they hadn't sent anyone else on that route. The woods, the whispers, the figures. I try not to think about them, but every now and then, when I'm alone on the highway, I feel their eyes on me, and the message rings in my ear. Keep driving. My name is Smith, and I've been trucking long enough to think I've seen it all. Strange sights, weird encounters, and eerie nights are part of the job, but nothing prepared me for what happened on a cold October night in the middle of nowhere. I was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Denver to Seattle. The route cut through some isolated patches of wilderness where the roads were barely lit and cell signals were as mythical as Bigfoot. That night, I was running behind schedule after a long delay at the way station. The highway ahead was a narrow, twisting path through a dense forest, the kind of place that swallowed sound and light alike. Around midnight, my stomach reminded me it had been hours since I'd eaten. I passed a sign that read, "Next service is 40 miles, and decided to pull over at the upcoming gas station for a break. The place wasn't marked on my GPS, but out here, anything resembling civilization was a welcome sight. The gas station appeared out of the trees like an oasis. A single fluorescent light flickered above the pumps, casting a sickly green glow over the cracked pavement. The attached convenience store was dark except for a neon open sign buzzing faintly in the window. A rusty pickup truck was parked haphazardly near the entrance, but otherwise the place seemed deserted. I parked my rig near the pumps and stepped out, the cold air biting through my jacket. The forest loomed on all sides, an oppressive wall of blackness. As I approached the store, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I chalked it up to exhaustion and hunger. Inside, the store was as uninviting as the exterior. The shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty cans and faded snack wrappers. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. Behind the counter sat an old man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes, staring at a small TV playing static. He didn't look up as I entered. "Evening," I said, grabbing a bag of chips and a soda. He didn't respond. "Rough night?" I tried again, setting my items on the counter. This time, he turned his head slowly, as if it took considerable effort. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an inexplicable chill. "You shouldn't stop here," he said in a voice that was more rasped than speech. "Not tonight." I laughed nervously. "Well, I'm already here. Just need a quick bite, and I'll be on my way." He shook his head, his gaze drifting toward the door. "They'll know you're here now." "Who?" I asked. But he didn't answer. He just pushed my items across the counter and muttered, "Keep your lights off when you leave." I paid and walked out, the man's cryptic warning gnawing at the edges of my mind. Back in the truck, I tore into the chips, keeping an eye on the forest. The trees seemed closer than before, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. As I started the engine, I noticed something odd. The rusty pickup was gone. I hadn't heard it leave, and the gas station's lot was empty except for my rig. Unease crept over me, but I dismissed it. People came and went. Nothing unusual about that. I pulled back onto the highway, the gas station's dim light fading quickly in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was pitch black, my headlights cutting feeble tunnels through the darkness. The forest pressed in on both sides, a suffocating wall of shadow. 20 minutes later, I spotted movement out of the corner of my eye. Something darted between the trees, too fast and too large to be a deer. My hands tightened on the wheel as I scanned the roadside. The thing was gone, but the uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time. "It's just your imagination," I muttered, but I didn't believe it. Up ahead, I saw taillights. Relieved to see another vehicle, I sped up to catch it. But as I drew closer, I realized something was off. The lights weren't moving. The vehicle, a rusty pickup truck, was parked on the shoulder, its driver's side door hanging open. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same truck from the gas station. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. The cab was empty, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Against my better judgment, I pulled over, grabbing my flashlight before stepping out. "Hello?" I called out, shining the light into the trees. No response. I approached the truck cautiously, my boots crunching on the gravel. The interior was a mess, papers and fast food wrappers strewn across the seats. A dark stain marred the driver's seat, and the air smelled of copper and decay. A low growl rumbled from the forest, freezing me in place. It wasn't the sound of any animal I'd ever heard. Deep and guttural, it vibrated in my chest, primal and hungry. I turned back to my truck, moving as quickly as I dared. The growl followed, growing louder. Just as I reached the cab, something crashed through the underbrush. I didn't look back. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and floored it. The truck roared to life, tires screeching as I sped down the highway. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something emerging from the trees. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long and its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It stood in the middle of the road watching me go. I didn't stop until I reached a small diner 30 miles down the road. The place was lit up like a beacon, a welcome sight after the nightmare I'd just experienced. I parked and stumbled inside, my hands still shaking. The waitress behind the counter looked up as I entered. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring me a cup of coffee. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I sat there trying to make sense of what I'd seen, a trucker at the next table leaned over. "You come through the forest?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I replied. "Why?" He exchanged a glance with the waitress, who suddenly looked uneasy. "That stretch of road ain't right," he said. "People see things out there, things that shouldn't exist." "What kind of things?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged, his expression grim. "Depends on who you ask. Some say it's spirits, others say it's worse. Whatever it is, you're lucky you made it out." The man's words lingered as I finished my coffee and stepped back outside. The night felt colder, heavier. I hesitated before climbing into my truck, half expecting to see those glowing yellow eyes in the shadows. The highway stretched ahead, a dark ribbon cutting through the endless forest. Back on the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise felt amplified. I kept my speed steady, refusing to glance into the rearview mirror. An hour later, the headlights picked up another figure standing at the side of the road. My heart dropped as I recognized the gaunt face of the old man from the gas station. His hollow eyes stared directly into my cab, unblinking. But how could he be here? I had left him miles behind. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. When I looked again, he was gone. My chest tightened as the radio crackled to life, filling the cab with static. A faint voice whispered through the interference, indistinct but undeniably there. I reached to turn it off, but it kept playing, the whispers growing louder and more urgent. Suddenly, my headlights flickered and died, plunging the truck into darkness. I hit the brakes, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The engine sputtered, then fell silent. I was alone, stranded in the heart of the forest. The growl came again, closer this time. It surrounded me, echoing through the trees like a chorus of predators. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the flashlight. Its beam barely cut through the oppressive blackness. Then I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of glowing yellow eyes staring at me from the trees. They moved closer, their owners, twisted, skeletal figures emerging into the dim light, their limbs contorted unnaturally, their mouths gaping with rows of jagged teeth. I scrambled out of the truck, running blindly into the forest. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I stumbled through the underbrush. The creatures followed, their growls and snarls filling the air. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't dare stop. Ahead, a faint light flickered. Desperation pushed me forward, and I burst into a clearing where an old cabin stood. Its windows glowed faintly, the only sign of safety in this nightmare. I threw myself against the door, pounding and screaming for help. The door creaked open, and an elderly woman stood there, her expression calm despite the chaos outside. She pulled me inside and bolted the door just as the creatures reached the clearing. "You shouldn't have come this way," she said, her voice eerily similar to the gas station attendant's. "What are those things?" I gasped, collapsing onto the floor. She shook her head. "They don't belong here, and neither do you. "Stay quiet, they'll leave by dawn." The night stretched on, every second an eternity. The creatures circled the cabin, their growls reverberating through the walls. The woman said nothing more, sitting silently in her chair as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. When the first rays of sunlight pierced the forest, the growls ceased. The woman opened the door and nodded toward the road. "Go. Don't look back." I stumbled back. My name's Joe Macklin, and I've been a trucker for 15 years. Over the years, I've driven through snowstorms in the Rockies, dodged tornadoes in Kansas, and dealt with my fair share of road rage. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on the Forgotten Highway, a stretch of road that, to this day, I can't find on any map. It started like any other night. My rig, loaded with lumber, was running a route through the Appalachian foothills. I was trying to make good time before a predicted storm rolled in. My dispatcher had given me a new shortcut, a route not marked on the GPS. It wasn't unusual. Experienced truckers often knew back roads that tech didn't. The route was supposed to shave an hour off my time, so I took it without a second thought. The road, a cracked 2-lane affair, wound through dense woods. My headlights barely cut through the dark, the trees forming an oppressive canopy overhead. A light fog hugged the ground, and the occasional chirp of crickets was the only sound. My CB radio, usually buzzing with chatter, was silent. The solitude wasn't new to me, but this road felt different, like it didn't want me there. About 10 miles in, I saw the first sign of trouble, an old rusted car abandoned on the shoulder. Its hood was up and the driver's door hung open. I slowed, scanning the surroundings. There were no houses nearby, no lights, just endless trees. I debated stopping to check it out but decided against it. Whoever had left that car wasn't here now, and I had a schedule to keep. As I passed the car, my radio crackled. "Help." The voice was faint, like it was coming from far away. I picked up the mic. "This is Big Mac. Who's out there?" No response, just static. I waited a moment, then shrugged it off. Radios sometimes picked up stray signals. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Strange encounters another 20 miles in. The road became rougher, potholes jarring my rig as I navigated the narrow lanes. Then I saw her, a woman standing in the middle of the road. She wore a white dress, her hair long and matted. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I came to a stop just feet away. She didn't move, didn't even flinch. I rolled down my window. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She turned her head slowly, her face pale and eyes hollow. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the idling engine. Before I could respond, she stepped off the road and disappeared into the woods. My skin crawled. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab. Shining the beam into the trees, I called out, "Ma'am, are you hurt?" The only reply was the rustling of leaves. I stood there for a moment, my gut telling me to leave, so I did. Climbing back into the truck, I locked the doors and pressed on. The loop an hour later, my nerves were frayed. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the scenery never changing. I checked the odometer. It didn't make sense. I should have hit the main highway by now. My gas gauge was dropping faster than it should too. Then I saw it, the same rusted car, the hood up and door open. My stomach sank. I slammed on the brakes, staring at it in disbelief. It was identical in every way, down to the broken taillight and the torn sticker on the bumper. "This can't be," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel. My radio crackled again. This time the voice was louder. "You need to leave. It won't let you go." "Who is this?" I barked into the mic. "What's going on?" No reply, just static. I glanced at the car again and froze. The woman was back, standing next to it, staring at me with those hollow eyes. She raised a hand, pointing down the road. I floored it, my truck roaring as I sped past her. My heart pounded as the trees blurred by. I didn't care where the road led anymore, I just wanted off. A glimpse of hope finally. After what felt like hours, I saw a light ahead. A cabin sat at the side of the road, smoke curling from its chimney. Relief washed over me. Pulling up, I killed the engine and grabbed my flashlight, stepping into the crisp night air. The cabin door creaked open before I could knock. An old man stood there, his face lined with age and his eyes sharp. "You're lost," he said, not a question but a statement. "I took a wrong turn," I admitted. "Can you tell me how to get back to the main highway?" He shook his head. "Ain't no way out once you're on the Forgotten Highway. It's got you now." My stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" He stepped aside, motioning me in. The inside of the cabin was cluttered but warm, a fire crackling in the hearth. Maps covered the walls, all marked with strange symbols and notes. "The highway's a trap," he explained, pouring a cup of coffee. "It feeds on people like you, those who don't belong. The more you fight it, the tighter its grip." "Is there any way out?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He nodded slowly. "But it'll cost you." The bargain, the old man handed me a map, the paper yellowed and brittle. "Follow this route exactly. Don't stop for anything, and whatever you do, don't look back. What happens if I do? You don't want to know." I took the map, my hands shaking. "Why are you helping me?" He gave a sad smile. "Because someone helped me once. Now go, before it's too late." I didn't need to be told twice. Thanking him, I hurried back to my truck and started the engine. The map led me onto a narrow dirt road that twisted deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches scraping against the sides of the cab. The radio crackled again. "You can't escape," the voice hissed. Ignoring it, I focused on the map. My headlights illuminated strange markings carved into the trees, symbols that matched those on the map. The air grew colder, frost forming on the windshield despite the heater blasting. The final test hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt meaningless on that road. Then I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the woods. My pulse quickened as shadows moved just beyond the reach of my headlights. Whatever was out there wasn't human. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of snapping branches. Something huge burst from the trees, a creature, its body a grotesque mix of fur and scales, its eyes glowing red. It charged at the truck, slamming into the side with enough force to rock the cab. I floored it, the engine screaming as I pushed the truck to its limits. The creature gave chase, its claws raking against the trailer. I didn't dare look back, remembering the old man's warning. The road began to incline, the truck struggling as the grade steepened. The creature's snarls grew fainter, then stopped altogether. When I reached the top of the hill, the forest abruptly ended. Ahead of me was the main highway, its familiar glow a welcome sight. The aftermath, I pulled over at the first rest stop I found, my hands trembling as I climbed out of the cab. The trailer was covered in deep gashes, the metal twisted and torn. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? But I never took a shortcut again, and sometimes on quiet nights I swear I hear the growl of that creature in the distance, reminding me that the forgotten highway is still out there,